All right. Well, we just got back from a trip across the country to a city, a very young city, fastest growing city in the state, that that has a similar thesis or theme behind it. Say maybe the beginning point of where we're headed with Neovia. Met the people there, wonderful people, great creators. And I do believe we will have some of them on our team to help with the building of Neovia. Today I had a very lengthy, you can see here by my notes, quite a lengthy speech here put together for you. But I think what I'm going to do instead, I have a rare headache. I usually don't get headaches. I think I'm dehydrated after the trip. We were on the run constantly in that humid weather where we were. So what I'm going to do instead is just talk to you about some of the topics that I was going to, instead of trying to work with my notes and strain my eyes. So the speech will be it won't be long today. It will be shorter, but I'll hit the main points with you. So to begin with, to start this book, I think you're all aware of it, that I've started a book. Well, I'm more than started. I'm well into it. Neovia. And a tentative working title is The City of Hope. But to start such a project, I had to determine, well, what is the true constraint? You see, great breakthroughs, major creations, actually usually come by identifying the true constraint and removing it. A good example was, and when I look here, I'm actually looking at you, which I like to do, but the camera's here, hello. The true constraint, let's say, of space flight. Well, that was identified fairly recently by Elon Musk, and SpaceX was built on removing this true constraint. And that constraint was getting payload, say a pound of payload, into orbit, reducing the cost of getting that payload, a pound of payload into orbit. Everything around SpaceX was built on that one, removing that one constraint. Everything, to the last screw that's put in his spaceships. So there are thousands and thousands of decisions that we can make and thoughts we can have about, let's just go back to Elon's creation, SpaceX. How do you deal with thousands? Well, if you know the true constraint, you can deal with all of them with clarity, with that helicopter view I talked to you about. So clarity, that's what I had to get for Neovia, the true constraint. And cutting through a lot of my notes here, explaining how and why and the effects and what effects had cause and effect. Wallace has talked to you a lot about cause and effect. Cutting through all that just to get to the main point here. The true constraint is safely closing that gap from discovery to deployment. It's not to increase scientific discoveries. Of all the scientists I've known, we have more than enough discoveries to largely reduce, if not cure, most of the suffering in the world today from diseases, from chronic diseases. So the true constraint is not we need to get more intelligent, we need more scientists, we need more breakthroughs. No, it's safely closing the gap from discovery to deployment. And largely what was in my notes were examples of that, just example after example after example. It's actually quite infuriating when you get a clear view of the constraints. And they're not just government constraints. There's, I'd say, a vast majority are such. But there's just what I call friction. Friction. Let's say a scientist is working remotely here on his work, and he doesn't have the connectivity with funding, for example. They don't have the connectivity with, say, those who can deal with the regulatory restrictions, and there's not a connectivity to manufacturing, for example. So everything is sort of fragmented. It's sort of like the way most people think today, fragmentation. And what Neovia is going to do, it's almost like, well, it's a major neothink. It's what I've taught you about thinking, and how we must integrate our thinking, stop fragmenting our thoughts, and that will bring us efficiency and power and results and creativity and productivity. And this, even with all of the regulatory restrictions, still, if we couldn't put a dent in the FDA, for example, which, by the way, I'm very confident that we can, not from the standpoint of necessarily reducing or counting on reducing regulations, but simply on updating and streamlining, particularly with the shifting of our time from more biological clinical trials to artificial intelligence and models and working through AI. So there's a lot of streamlining and updating that needs to be done. But even without that, starting with local municipalities, just permitting and the ease of permitting, that's huge. That's huge. And then bringing together the fragmented parts of closing that gap. It's very, very doable. It's just no venture has ever set out to do that. And that's what we're going to do. So closing a gap and safely closing a gap. You see, I call it a myth. There's a myth that to speed up the progress, closing the gap means sacrificing or letting up on safety. And that's absolutely false. You can safely close the gap, and safety is very important because, well, let me put it this way. You have two sides to suffering. One side is if you were too rash, too quick at getting breakthroughs, discoveries out, and deploying those, and you have, say, disastrous results. Possibly like the COVID shots. That will be determined over the years to come. So you expose people to risk. But there's also the opposite side of that, and that's getting out too slowly, where you have people dying and people suffering. That's every bit of a risk as getting discoveries out too quickly. So you have to come in with an integrated mind, not a fragmented mind, not a hierarchical structure, way of thinking. And you have to get in and say, all right, how do we close the gap safely? Because it can be done. The more I dig into it, the more dramatic this becomes. The 10 to 20 years, the 1 out of 10 getting accepted, the $1 to $5 billion. The investors run away. The scientists are spending their time running around looking for funding instead of working on their breakthroughs. Well, all of that needs to change. A lot of it can change just at the municipal level, municipality level, which we will, well, we're working toward our own municipality. So it starts there, and it works its way up to state and then federal. This will all come out, by the way, in my book, Neovia, which I'm sure all of you will be getting a copy of that. So we're going to safely close the gap, not just close the gap, but safely close the gap. And similar to SpaceX, when I identified that as our true constraint, and that is our nucleus, our magnetic pull, everything is drawn to Neovia based on that, removing that constraint. The power in that and who that will attract and bring together an ecosystem, somewhat like what happened with Silicon Valley. Now, very important, going to the, I guess, to my origin story, a very important part of it is, well, what I say, what the child can see that the adult cannot see. You see, this happened to me. When I was young, I found myself drawn to a question that seemed different than other kids my age would ever ask. But particularly as I saw my grandparents, their whole life changed based on their physical limitations to a place where they had never chosen that for themselves. And as a child, my mind is like, why does it have to be this way? Why do they have to suffer? Now, an adult would say, oh, well, that's just part of aging. That's what happens, right? That's just part of getting older. Because adults, they are normalized to the whole concept of aging, deterioration of the body, age-related diseases, suffering, and death. But to a child who has not had a lot of exposure to suffering and age-related diseases and dementia and suffering, well, to a child, it's much more impactful. And a child starts saying, why does grandma, my beloved grandma, I love my grandma, why does she act like this? My grandpa, why is he in pain? See, a child, it's almost to the point of traumatic. So a child can see that it's unnatural, that that's not normal. Where adults, where their parents have been normalized, this has been normalized. So this began in me as a child, as I'm sure it does in almost all children. But for different reasons, it never left me. That original interaction with aging and suffering became part of my soul. It's a point where I found that I would find myself reading, as I got a little older, reading with fascination stories about, say, like Louis Pasteur curing rabies. Or one was very fascinating to me was, it floored me, was the whole idea of children living their lives in an iron lung because of something called polio. And as a child, I saw certain adults who had been inflicted with polio and, had diminished limbs, for example. And they were the lucky ones, I was told. So, I read the stories about smallpox killing hundreds of millions of people around the world. Even in the 20th century, 300 million people in the 20th century killed by smallpox. And then I read about the cowpox vaccine and Jenner. And so to me, those stories were fascinating, far more fascinating than, say, like war stories. I mean, war stories were fascinating, don't get me wrong, but it's like none of my friends ever talked about these people who saved more lives than, say, a great military maneuver or military success, or a great empire with a great leader, a great king. I began to see my heroes, they wore lab coats, not crowns. So I was very impacted by all of this. Fleming and the the antibiotics. And these were the stories that had an impact on me. So, when people say, and as I get more into the social media and the podcast world, people ask me and do ask me, where did you start? What's your origin story? At what point did you sit down and review this business structure of Neovia, or come upon these economic concepts and maneuvers? And when I really think about it, it all started when I was a young child. And as I grew older, and my peers, and I've talked to you about how their eyes would glaze over when I would talk about curing the diseases of aging. Eyes would glaze over. They wanted more dramatic, more exciting thoughts to be discussed. Well, I knew there was something different happening. So that's where the origins of Neovia is, from my childhood. And of course, my father had a major impact with neotech. And as I was a child, and he would talk to me about the greatest value on earth is the human life. And as a child, I've respected and looked up to him. He was this very successful scientist at DuPont. I thought, great, I never have to worry about a thing. He's going to cure aging. I'll be set, he'll be set, and I'll never have to concern myself with it. Well, of course, it doesn't happen that way, that quickly. And of course, I lost him, I lost my mother. The aging and the loss was all around me. And that seed was planted in me from my father, and then my observations of what age-related disease and the acceptance of it. The child of the past never let that go, never left me in that regard, and a big impact on me. And in telling you about this, I'm going to show you something very interesting for Neovia, and it will affect a lot of you too. I believe a powerful effect on me growing up was my childhood dog. I was very young when we got Blackjack, was his name. Remember, my father was a poker player in his earlier years. So he said, what do you think of Blackjack? And, the card game Blackjack. And I loved the name. And then for short, we call him Mac. Come here, Mac. But his formal name was Blackjack, so he knew both Blackjack and Mac. Got very attached to Blackjack, to Mac. And as a child, you don't really think, unless you see your grandparents suffer, aging is so far out there, it doesn't really enter your mind. A lot of you probably remember in my books the story about my grandmother and the funnel of life. And at the beginning, you're up here and don't even think about aging, but then you get pulled down to that little exit tube at the end. And so children don't think about this, but I do recall, my closeness with my dog and seeing him age, and that had an impact on me because he went from this little bundle of joy, this little puppy with endless energy, to losing his vitality, his energy, and then suffering, and then the dreaded trips to the vet, and then that last moment in his last breath. That's very traumatic on a young child. They see the whole cycle of life and death. And we all get so attached to our companion animals. And we realize we have them for much, much too short of a time. Now, we all know we'd love to have more years with our pets, with our companion animals. Now, everything I just said, realize that happens because your pet ages approximately, if we talk about dogs, for example, approximately 7 times faster than you do. So that gave me, and it was the impact of my childhood pet. You grieve. I don't grieve today, but I still have vivid memories of moments with Blackjack. They never leave. And remember the hit song by Bob Dylan, Mr. Bojangles? Mr. Bojangles still grieved 15 years after he lost his dog. So, but why is that? Because they age 7 times faster than us. And think about it. They get the same diseases we get. They get cancer. They get heart disease. They get dementia. So I started thinking, what a beautiful thing if we can have a division in Neovia dedicated to longevity for our companion animals. Just think of the bond and the beauty of that. You're working to extend your pets' healthy lives. Nothing about Neovia is about suffering life. Everything about it is flourishing life. And we will get more into that in my future talks. The good life, eudaimonia. No one wants to live to 95 like this, right? We want to live to 95 like this, feeling good and energetic. And that's another whole discussion about Neovia. That element of purpose, excitement, flourishing is going to be the drawing card to the population. See, I'm speaking beyond the scientists now and the manufacturers and the research and development and the actual practical closing of the gap from discovery to deployment. I'm now talking about the citizens, you and I, living in Neovia. I got a little experience of this the last week when I visited this. I'm not going to say the name of the city. Those of you on Ascension know the name, and I'd like you to, at this point, keep that to yourselves, okay? Because I just can't have people talking about these things out there. There are certain things that I do want you to share, like these videos. You can send them to as many people as you want. But when I name very specific circumstances, such as the city I visited, the young city, that's just amongst us. So only Ascension members right now know about this. But that's the underlying theme or drawing card of this city I visited. And I realized that's what we need in Neovia, where people are drawn from around the world just to live there and to have, because of the nature of living there, people live long, people with purpose live longer. It can be quantified through metrics. And people in Neovia are going to discover purpose, and they're going to experience the good life, and they will live longer. What a drawing card, right? Aside from the breakthrough research and development and safe deployment, you're also going to have this community. And I will say ultimately many communities around the world where you discover purpose and exhilaration and live with purpose, with human flourishing, what Aristotle called eudaimonia. So yes, I'm introducing a new section just for you to understand. It's called the Companion Animal Division of Neovia. And there's a beautiful relationship there because we love our pets. And our pets unconditionally love us. So as we learn to extend their lives, what we learn in that process with our pets, with more flexibility, will in turn come back and extend our lives. And that's what they would want. And that's what we want. So I'm introducing that among the other things I said today. I do think, let me just briefly glance here. I do think I'm going to call it. By the way, what I didn't speak about today, don't worry, it's all going to be in my book. Because I'm under pressure to get this book out because of investors we're working with partners we are working with countries we are working with. They need to see this. This is aside from this recent trip, this is my day and night focus now. So all the points I did not cover with you today will all be in my book. Every last, I know all of you will be getting my book. So I think I touched on the points I wanted to. You can tell this would have been a lengthy talk today, right? I feel I covered everything I needed to today. Continue staying close to us. Continue to viewing my YouTube channel for any new talks that I put up there. And also be on the lookout for something very interesting. Wallace, have we given that a name yet? Boom. What do we call that? Where you slam that on the glass and we go to town. See, Wallace and I have these, I don't know what you call them, just these sessions that just they go crazy. We just go into these, our second mind, I've talked to you about that. Our second mind just kicks in and we'll go for an hour, hour and a half, just making breakthroughs that are unbelievable. And then later we'll say, for crying out loud, none of that was recorded for posterity. So he just invested in some good camera equipment and some suction cups. So we're sitting in the car, he slams that up on the windshield and it will film us, and we're going to start putting those up on my YouTube channel because we think those are going to be home runs. Yes, we're also going to do our podcasts. Podcasts are well prepared. These are just the second mind kicking in, taking over. I don't know if I should mention this to you, but Wallace, as a kid, used to have a name for me when his high school friends were over or middle school friends were over, and Marco's middle school friends were over, or high school friends, and Frankie's friends were over. I'd be in another room, and then I could be on a phone call or a Zoom meeting, and all of a sudden I lock in. And I go on very assertively about the next move I'm going to be making. And suddenly, these middle school kids and high school kids that are all over there just shooting a breeze in another room, they all just shut up and no one says anything to each other, but all their heads are pointed toward me. This is what Wallace and Marco and Frankie have all described to me. That's the mode we get into. Wallace used to call it warrior mark. He would say, you get in that warrior mark mode. So we're going to start recording these moments where the second mind kicks in, or in my case, warrior mark kicks in. And Wallace, I call it his second mind. It's just all of a sudden, just something comes in that just takes over. I witnessed that when we were in this other city at dinner, and all of a sudden, everyone at the table was purely quiet as Wallace just went into his second mind, just took over, and they were asking questions, and every question they could possibly have was answered during that dinner because of this. So you'll be getting the fruits of some of these sessions we've always gone into, and they're very exciting, and I mean, they're truly, they're life-changing because they are changing the future. So I'm going to call it at that. You go drink some water, get hydrated, and as always, it's fantastic seeing all of you, and I love you guys. I'm going to turn it back over to Wallace. Good evening.